The Lagos Business School today in the commercial capital of Nigeria held a forum that featured a keynote presentation by the IMF Country Director for Nigeria, Ari Eisen. There was also a panel of discussants that drilled into forum focused on Sub-Saharan Africa's regional economic outlook as the new year 2023 beckons. Let's take some of the excerpts from the panel that also featured the IMF country chief.
If there is one priority of any economic policy, which we are all trying to achieve by raising welfare, is to make sure, morally first, of course, that there is food in the table. If you are not morally attached to that, which will be surprising, because we are all have high integrity in this room, you know, from a developmental point of view, if a child below the year of 5 has not eaten enough, it's gone. It's a machine that will not be operating well in adulthood if it manages to survive. So there is no question, from whatever style, morally, as an economist, what you want to think of, food security is a critical policy objective, you know? So what should policymakers do to address this food insecurity? First, you know, maybe surprising to many, allow global prices to pass through into domestic prices. Why is it so important to believe in the price system, colleagues here? Because if prices don't go up enough, the farmers will not want to produce more. The objective, the profit mobilization or the profit incentive for farmers to produce more requires that prices of food go up so that you can have a supply reaction for food production, for farmers. Then the natural question, but what do we do with the population that cannot pay? Well, that's the second part. You target those rich people who will have to suffer a little bit more and they will have to pay higher prices. Those who are poor, and sometimes it's difficult to differentiate, to separate everyone, but you need to put registers in place and recognize and identify. You need to put effort to identify the most vulnerable. If you can, maybe in some cases you can think about universal subsidies, but I think we have passed that of universal subsidies, and I will talk about that. But you need to target cash transfers and spend social safety nets to protect those who will have to pay higher prices. So in an emergency, and here it's very important, when COVID hit, it was not possible to critically develop a register of who is the most vulnerable. So in an emergency, you just universalize and you bring cash transfers and you subsidize food or fuel even, just to protect everyone, because it's too, in an emergency you're not able to differentiate. But that's not anymore the case. We are no longer in the same type of emergencies, and even if you were, emergencies have been accumulating, and budgets cannot afford to universalize support the way they used to be. So it's critical to start moving really from an emergency mindset where you do subsidies that are untargeted, very costly, and distortionary. Distortionary because the supply side needs to respond to higher prices. So they should be gradually phased out. Of course, no one wants big disruptions, but it needs to be well explained to the population. And here it's an important issue with the fuel subsidies, that simply it costs 2% of GDP at the moment in Nigeria. And it's bigger than the budgets for health and education. And who is benefiting from fuel subsidies that are universal? I think a reflection on that is very critical for this time in Nigeria.
But again, he pointed out food insecurity. We are actually at a point where lag in economic variables will hit us in 2023. We all saw the flooding that took place this year. We all witnessed how rice skyrocketed in terms of moving towards moving towards 50, I don't know if it's more than 50,000 naira per 50 kg bag of rice. Now, you can see the quantum jump. He talked about basket of prices going up. So we are seeing prices translate in the transport sector, in the commodity space, especially with agri produce. How is this happening? We saw what happened with the flooding. We're also seeing what is happening in terms of imported inflation, exchange rate dynamics. It is all hitting the agricultural sector by way of input. All the tech that we take into the sector, the exchange rate is coming to bite back that sector. So what is the way forward? One of the things Ari talked about is that we need to pass through international prices into domestic prices. Interestingly, I do not quite agree. We are not competitive at what we do. We have actually not added value to most of the things we produce. If you look at on the top of our list, the list of things we export, agricultural produce we export, we have sesame, we have raw cashew nuts, we have sesame, we have cashew nuts. Now, these things are in their raw state. We have actually not added value, enough value to be able to attract. Then when you look at, on top of it, you're looking at cassava. But all of these things we sell to the world market, we are actually not competitive in terms of our yield, measured in tons per hectare. So if you allow international prices to pass through, you're likely to have what is happening in the rice value chain today, where imported rice is dominating the Nigerian market, and gradually dumping is taking place in the market, where we're gradually fizzling out the rice, those in the rice value chain. So we need to manage our prices. We need to put checks in terms of commodities that we are bringing into the country. So because of time, oil price, just this last one. If you look at our crude palm oil, in our Q3 2022 report, Nigeria actually imported crude palm oil. Why are we importing palm oil when Nigeria was the leading producer of palm oil in 1961? So something is not adding up. Competitively, we are not competitive, which means if you allow prices to pass through, you will kill our local industry.
Prof, I want to come to you because a lot of everything that has been presented has to deal with the political economy, not just for Nigeria, but also on the African continent. And one of his slides looked at the need to build resilience and also how we can fight fires. Now, within the political space, and we're not going into politics, but can you share some of your reflections on what are the areas we need to be mindful of, and how can we start to prepare for a stronger political economy that can help us to actualize some of the changes that we want?
The economy was growing at about 6% average in those years. Indeed, in 2010, I think the economy was growing at about 7%. If something has worked, I think you should adopt it. So it's a bit counterintuitive or maybe counterproductive that we have spent 8 years experimenting with one direction. I mean, development requires experimentation, of course, but also requires agility. If something is not working, to try something else. So I think that's a particular issue, which probably relates is really political economy, because when you are not at least using those markets, some people, some interests are benefiting, and that distortion is certainly something we must get away from. The political will to sort of do what has worked, I think, is something that any incoming administration, in fact, all the political contenders must be united on that point now. Unfortunately, the social fabric of the social contract is fragile, and that makes it difficult to advocate and implement the policies that seem to make more sense. There are two ways of going about it. Let me say, the issue of tightening that Ari has mentioned, I think you can't really quarrel with it. The issue, though, is can you get the populace to go along?